The lake had become my quiet escape from everything. Every morning at sunrise, when the world was still asleep, I'd grab my fishing rod, slip on my old boots, and make my way down to the dock. The wooden boards creaked softly beneath my feet, a familiar sound that felt more like a greeting than a warning. The water was always calm at that hour, glassy and still, reflecting the pale gold of the morning sky. This place wasn't just property to me, it was peace, the kind of peace I had spent years chasing. I'd left the noise and rules of city life behind to find a corner of the world that was truly mine. Unlike the HOA-controlled neighborhood that surrounded me, my land and my lake were outside their reach. They couldn't dictate how I lived here. I didn't need permission to fish at sunrise, build my dock, or host a quiet evening by the water. That independence was a small victory I savored every day. But not everyone shared that feeling. I often caught neighbors peering through hedges, whispering to each other. Their polished lawns, identical mailboxes, and matching fences were monuments to control. And I didn't fit their mold. One morning, as I reeled in a base, I noticed 3 members of the HOA board gathered at the cul-de-sac, staring toward my lake with narrowed eyes. Their fingers pointed in my direction, their faces stiff and serious, like they were discussing a problem that needed to be solved. The air suddenly felt colder, the kind of quiet before a storm. I could sense their resentment festering. I knew they didn't like my independence, but I never imagined just how far they would go to destroy it. This was only the beginning. It started with something small, almost easy to overlook. One morning, as I walked down to the dock, the air felt different, heavier, tainted. I couldn't quite place it at first, but the lake no longer carried its usual crisp, fresh scent. Instead, a faint chemical odor lingered above the water like an invisible warning. I brushed it off as nothing, maybe some runoff from the rain the night before. But the next day, I found 2 dead bass floating near the edge, their bellies up, their silvery scales dull in the morning light. My chest tightened as I knelt beside them. I had fished this lake for years and never, not once, had I seen something like this. The change was subtle but undeniable. The water's surface lost its natural shimmer and began to develop a faint greenish film, something unnatural spreading slowly from the far end. The birds that usually landed near the shore kept their distance, and the usual splashes of fish breaking the water's surface were gone. It was as if the life had drained from the lake overnight. I mentioned it casually to a neighbor who lived near the HOA board president. They leaned closer, lowering their voice, and told me there had been a special meeting, just days earlier. My name and my lake had been a topic of discussion. According to them, the board was tired of me fishing and wanted to take back control of the community's view. That phrase stuck in my head like a thorn. When I walked back home, I noticed the same board members watching from across the street, their expressions unreadable. I couldn't prove anything yet, but deep down, a heavy suspicion started to grow. Something was wrong with the lake, and it wasn't by accident. I didn't wait long before deciding to confront them. My patience had already been worn thin by the smell, the dead fish, and the way the water seemed to change with each passing day. I walked straight to the HOA office that morning, a small brick building that looked overly polished, just like everything else in the neighborhood. Inside, the air was thick with fake smiles and stiff posture. The president, a woman who always spoke like she was giving a speech, greeted me with that same rehearsed grin. "I need to talk about the lake," I said firmly. Her grin didn't fade. If anything, it grew wider. I told her about the smell, the dead fish, the strange film spreading across the water. She tilted her head slightly, pretending to look concerned, and then dismissed it as a natural algae bloom. I'd lived by that lake for years. I knew its patterns. This wasn't algae. The other board members sat around the table, exchanging glances. One of them actually smirked when I mentioned the lab results I was planning to get. They thought they were untouchable. "It's not technically part of the HOA," she finally said, "but if it affects the view of the community, we have a right to address it." That sentence chilled me more than the chemical smell on the dock. It was their way of admitting they wanted control without saying it outright. As I turned to leave, their eyes followed me like vultures circling something already dying. Outside, the sun was bright, but the lake no longer felt safe. Their confidence told me everything I needed to know. They'd done something and didn't think I could stop them. That was their mistake. This wasn't just a pond. This was my lake, and I wasn't backing down. I stopped confronting them outright and went silent. It was the kind of quiet that made people uneasy, the kind that made those who had done something wrong start to question how much you actually knew. Every day I walked down to the lake as usual, pretending nothing had changed, but behind the scenes, I was building my case piece by piece. I kept copies of the lab results in a locked folder, photographed the spreading contamination daily, and wrote down every detail I noticed: the smell, the discoloration, the wildlife disappearing. I even noted the times certain HOA board members walked by suspiciously close to the water after dark. Next, I installed small, motion-activated cameras along the shoreline. They were well hidden in the reeds, nearly invisible. If anyone came back to dump more chemicals, I would have proof. I also reached out to a local environmental lawyer, a sharp man who didn't flinch when I showed him the lab reports. He explained exactly how serious the situation was. If I could prove HOA involvement, they wouldn't just be fined, they could be forced to cover the entire cleanup and face criminal charges. But I didn't tell anyone about the biggest card I held: their drinking water. The same groundwater that fed their pristine lawns and kitchen sinks was connected to my lake. All I had to do was wait. Their actions had already set the consequences in motion. I wanted them to feel that dread slowly creep in, the way I had when I found my fish dead along the shore. So I smiled when I saw them watching me from across the street. I kept fishing like always. They thought they'd won. But in reality, I was preparing for their collapse, patiently, carefully, one documented fact at a time. The first signs of panic came quietly, almost the same way the contamination had begun. One morning, as I stood on the dock, I heard shouting from across the street. A woman in a bathrobe was standing in her driveway, holding a glass of murky water in her hand. A few minutes later, two more neighbors appeared, talking loudly, their faces twisted with confusion and worry. I could hear snippets of their conversation carried on the breeze. Words like smell, rotten, and water. I reeled my line in slowly, pretending to ignore them, but inside, I knew exactly what was happening. By noon, the neighborhood group chats and calls to the HOA had exploded. Complaints poured in about foul-tasting water, strange discoloration, and a smell that wouldn't go away. Some even reported rashes after showering. The HOA board scrambled, holding an emergency meeting. They sent out an email blaming a temporary plumbing issue and urged residents to remain calm. But fear had a way of spreading faster than lies. People wanted answers, and none of the board's excuses could mask the growing alarm. Every day after that, the tension grew thicker. Bottled water deliveries piled up on porches, and neighbors whispered in worried clusters near their mailboxes. The once pristine image of the HOA-run community was starting to crack. Meanwhile, I sat on my dock, quietly watching it unfold. The same lake they had tried to ruin was turning against them. What none of them knew was that the contamination wasn't just near the surface anymore. It had already seeped deep into the groundwater. The same system they relied on for everything was carrying their actions back to them. They had poisoned my lake, but now the poison belonged to them too. It was only the beginning of their reckoning. The first signs of panic came quietly, almost the same way the contamination had begun. One morning, as I stood on the dock, I heard shouting from across the street. A woman in a bathrobe was standing in her driveway, holding a glass of murky water in her hand. A few minutes later, two more neighbors appeared, talking loudly, their faces twisted with confusion and worry. I could hear snippets of their conversation carried on the breeze. Words like smell, rotten, and water. I reeled my line in slowly, pretending to ignore them, but inside, I knew exactly what was happening. By noon, the neighborhood group chats and calls to the HOA had exploded. Complaints poured in about foul-tasting water, strange discoloration, and a smell that wouldn't go away. Some even reported rashes after showering. The HOA board scrambled, holding an emergency meeting. They sent out an email blaming a temporary plumbing issue and urged residents to remain calm. But fear had a way of spreading faster than lies. People wanted answers, and none of the board's excuses could mask the growing alarm. Every day after that, the tension grew thicker. Bottled water deliveries piled up on porches, and neighbors whispered in worried clusters near their mailboxes. The once pristine image of the HOA-run community was starting to crack. Meanwhile, I sat on my dock, quietly watching it unfold. The same lake they had tried to ruin was turning against them. What none of them knew was that the contamination wasn't just near the surface anymore. It had already seeped deep into the groundwater. The same system they relied on for everything was carrying their actions back to them. They had poisoned my lake, but now the poison belonged to them too. It was only the beginning of their reckoning. It didn't take long before the HOA president showed up at my property, dressed in her usual tailored blazer and fake politeness. She walked down my driveway with forced confidence, clutching a folder in one hand like it made her more important. I was sitting on the dock when she approached, pretending to be focused on tying a new lure to my fishing line. Her heels clicked against the wooden planks as she tried to mask the tension in her voice. "Have you noticed anything strange with the lake lately?" she asked, as if we were just neighbors having a casual chat. I didn't give her the satisfaction of an immediate answer. I glanced at her over my shoulder, letting the silence stretch. She shifted uncomfortably, then softened her tone, hinting that if I knew something, the HOA might be able to work with me. That's when I smiled, not kindly, but the kind of smile that says I'm holding something they don't understand. I slowly reached into my tackle box and pulled out a thick envelope. Inside were copies of the lab reports, photos of the contamination, and time-stamped evidence of the lake's decline. When I laid the papers on the dock between us, her face lost its practiced calm. I told her exactly what the tests showed: the herbicides, the unnatural levels, the damage to the ecosystem. And then I explained the part she hadn't considered: the groundwater. Every glass of water they drank came from the very lake they'd poisoned. Her lips parted, but no words came out. She tried to compose herself, stammering something about resolving this quietly, but I cut her off. I had already contacted the state environmental department. What she didn't know was that their investigation had already begun. Their control over the situation was gone. The inspectors arrived 2 days later, their white trucks rolling through the neighborhood like a silent army. They wore reflective vests, carried clipboards, and moved with a kind of calm authority that made even the most arrogant HOA board members falter. Neighbors gathered in small clusters at the ends of their driveways, whispering nervously as the officials took water samples from outdoor spigots, storm drains, and the lake itself. I watched from my porch, arms crossed, as the HOA president tried to greet them like she was in control of the situation. But she wasn't. Not anymore. The investigation moved quickly. The state environmental team traced the source of the contamination back to the contractor the HOA had secretly hired to treat the edges of the lake for aesthetic purposes. What they had actually done was dump a concentrated chemical herbicide meant for commercial fields, not residential water sources. Worse, they had no permits and no environmental clearance. When the lead inspector held up the violation notice, the HOA president's confident mask finally cracked. Within days, official reports were filed, and word spread through the entire subdivision. Fines were issued, and they weren't small. We were talking hundreds of thousands of dollars for environmental damage and contamination of the water supply. Several board members stepped down almost immediately, unable to handle the backlash. The once smug faces that used to glare at me from across the street now avoided my eyes entirely. The neighborhood that once saw me as a problem now saw me as the man who had been right all along. Their picture-perfect community was unraveling faster than they could hold it together. And the best part? I hadn't lifted a finger to ruin them. They had done it all to themselves. The lawsuit came down like a hammer. Once the environmental reports were made public, attorneys circled the HOA like vultures. Homeowners who had once blindly followed the board now turned against them, furious about the contaminated water and the mounting costs. Several families had already spent thousands replacing filters, buying bottled water, and dealing with health scares. And when they discovered that the HOA had acted without approval from the wider community, their loyalty crumbled overnight. I sat across from the HOA's legal team in the courtroom, a place they never expected to find themselves because of me. My lawyer slid the folder of evidence across the table with quiet confidence. Lab results, photographs, and camera footage of late-night activities by the lake. The opposing counsel tried to spin it, blaming the contractor and calling it a miscommunication. But the state's environmental agency's findings were ironclad. The HOA had authorized illegal dumping. The judge's tone was sharp and unforgiving. They were ordered to pay for the entire cleanup, reimburse every affected homeowner, and cover my legal fees and damages to the lake. It wasn't just a loss. It was a public humiliation. The HOA president, once so proud and controlling, avoided eye contact with me as the ruling was read aloud. Her authority, her power, her image, all of it unraveled in that moment. When I stepped out of the courthouse, the air felt different. Neighbors who had once whispered about me now nodded silently in acknowledgement. They understood the truth now. The board's arrogance had brought this disaster upon them. The lake they tried to control had ended up exposing them. For me, it wasn't about revenge anymore. It was about justice. They finally learned that some battles can't be won with petty rules and power plays. The lake took time to heal, but nature has a way of reclaiming itself when given the chance. After the cleanup crews finished their work and the water treatment systems were installed, the green film that once choked the surface began to disappear. Day by day, the water cleared, returning to the calm, glassy reflection I had loved so much. New fish were introduced to replace what had been lost, and their small ripples in the early morning light felt like a promise that the worst was finally behind me. The air no longer carried that chemical bite, only the soft scent of wet earth and pine. The HOA wasn't the same anymore. Most of the board had resigned in disgrace, and those who remained had no interest in picking fights. The neighborhood meetings that were once filled with smug glances and whispered complaints now carried a quieter, more respectful tone. No one tried to tell me what to do with my lake anymore. In fact, some even asked for advice on how to keep the ecosystem healthy. It was ironic, really. The same people who had once despised my independence were now forced to respect it. I found myself spending more time on the dock again, just as I used to. I'd cast my line into the water and watch the sun rise, feeling the calm settle deep in my chest. The fight had cost me time, energy, and patience, but I had won. Not through shouting or breaking rules, but by letting their own actions turn against them. As the wind rippled across the lake's surface, I realized this place was more than just mine. It was a reminder that some things can't be controlled or taken. The lake endured, and so did I. And this time, the silence was truly peaceful.